Hey, welcome to the Christ Revealed YouTube channel. I got a great interview coming up for you. Really great to be here with you. Enjoy this interview. What do you think are some of the biggest problems for the resurrection as you're putting the case together? And you've laid out, how you kind of got to your conclusions. But what do you think are some of the problems that exist? Because, like you said, it can't. We don't have a videotape account of it.
Right.
So when you are dealing with people who are still trying to push back on your own conclusions, what are some of the biggest challenges there?
Well, I think the biggest challenge is that people would say they can't trust the Gospels for any number of reasons. Now, if they're saying they can't trust the Gospels because they include miracles, well, then that's going to be a tough one to kind of counter, because that's a presuppositional bias against the supernatural, and that's not something that it's a presuppositional bias. You're going to have to at least be honest with yourself and suspend it for a season. While you look at this. And if you can't suspend it, at least understand it's a heart issue, not a head issue. This is something that you just can't let go of, and you have to kind of remember that.
And with that, though, because there's so many other pieces of cooperation between the Gospels. Sure. So that would be.
Well, let's put it this way: people would say, "Well, how can I trust that this thing's been transmitted properly?" I think the best and the most powerful objection I've heard on this is from Bart Ehrman, right? Bart is a guy who is a scholar and seems to be actually a very winsome guy as well, so I can understand why people would actually like to read his books. I've read his books. He was a Christian, raised in the church, first shaken, he says in a book called Jesus Interrupted, at Moody Bible Institute. So he's at a Christian university in the first class in textual criticism and Bible. And he is told, and he had never heard this until that point, he is told that we don't have a single original copy, original autograph of any New Testament book. So if you, for example, were curious, well, I'm not quite sure the Constitution of the United States actually says that, well, you could actually go back and see the original Constitution under glass, and you could see what it really said. We can't do that with the New Testament. Not any book from the New Testament, not any letter. He also said, to make it matters worse, we don't have the first copy of the original. We don't have the copy of the copy of the copy of the first copy of the original. The earliest copy we have in many cases is late in history, 3rd, 4th century. And the most ancient copies we have of some of these books, some of these letters, some of these Gospels, when you compare them to one another, they have thousands of small variations. He says more variations than there are words in the New Testament. That's, I think, powerful. Yeah. It was powerful for me. What it all comes down to is I needed to know, even if I could date the Gospels early, and I think we can, how do we know what those Gospels said? How do we know that the Jesus that was written about in the earliest days wasn't changed dramatically over time? Until finally the version we have today, as in a book that Bart wrote, Jesus becomes God because he has been transformed from the wise sage who never worked miracles, was never born of a virgin, never died on a cross and rose from the dead. All of these things have been added to the story until finally we have the Christ of Christianity. Now that was something that was troubling for me, and I needed to know. But I think my casework was helpful in that sense, because I know this is a claim that's often made by defense attorneys about pieces of evidence we bring in a trial. Oh, you have this piece of evidence you found at the crime scene. Oh, really? And you think there's a mark on that piece of evidence that demonstrates it belongs to the defendant's gun. Oh, really? Well, it's 30 years now. How do I know that the one you're showing me today is the same piece of evidence from the crime scene? I mean, for all I know, you pulled it out of property 20 years later and you etched in that little mark that you're now saying is so definitive, and it was never part of the original, and now you're trying to make a case against my defendant when in fact that's been altered evidence. Okay, same claim. We have an original that's different from the version we have today because someone made a change along the way. So what we typically ask is, okay, well, how about this? There's an officer who was at the crime scene back in 1980 when that thing was collected, and when he took the collection, he wrote a report describing that little mark, that it was really there back then. Maybe he even took a Polaroid. Now he gives it to the next guy, maybe the property room. They make a description of the same piece of property, and they also mentioned that little mark. I bring it to someone brings it to the crime lab years later. They they also mention the mark. I take it from the crime lab. I write a report. It also mentions the mark. So now I have report after report after report of this thing over time, in which the mark is described. I know it hasn't changed. Each of us is like a link in the chain that brings it from the past to the present. We call this the chain of custody. Who has been handling the evidence over time? Well, it turns out there's chains of custody for the New Testament. So John, for example, he writes something, but I'm not sure. I mean, did he really write what we have today? Well, we could test it because he had 3 students that he gave it to. And they wrote letters to local congregations describing what he said. They also had a student named Irenaeus. Irenaeus wrote what his teachers said. That was Ignatius of Polycarp. Then Irenaeus has got a student, Hippolytus. Now we can go through all the links in the chain of custody to see if the story of Jesus is changing. And as I did that, I realized it never changes. Everything from the miraculous virgin birth to all the miracles, to the resurrection, to the ascension into heaven, to the Orthodox Christian doctrines of deity of Christ, all these things are not late additions. The very first links we have in this chain of custody, those elements are present. So look, in the end, I might not like what I'm reading about Jesus, but you can't claim that that was added later, because it wasn't added later. It's the first story. It's early in history, which, by the way, makes it hard to lie. If you're going to lie after when everyone's dead.
Right.
That's a good way to lie. Or lie out of the region. If it's early in the region, much harder. We have early in the region accounts that never change. So I just knew that every way you look at this, and every objection that I could level against it, all in the end came down to either I don't like miracles, or I don't want there to be a God, because I have been God all this time. And I don't really want anyone else to take my place. And it really comes down to those two. And so again, was it rational? I mean, I always would have voiced these as rational objections, or were they really deep-seated volitional objections that I simply didn't want this to be true? And so I had to ask those kinds of tough questions, because every way you could test it, it's going to pass that test. And then you're just stuck with what might be the underlying reason why we're denying this. Now, look, people can also point to other things they don't like about Scripture. But I tried to walk through each and every one of those objections because I held those myself. This wasn't an effort for me to be a good apologist. This was an effort for me to say, were these objections valid?
That's it for this particular interview. Thanks for joining me. Really excited to take this ongoing journey with you as we keep bringing more content. If you haven't already, you really should subscribe to this channel. There's a lot of phenomenal content coming down the road into the future that you'll want to know about. Leave a comment down here. I think people would love to hear from you, and then you can hear from them too. If you liked it, go ahead and give a like. It only takes half a second, and share this with people that you care about. The world needs more light in it right now. So thanks for being with me. Hope to connect with you again soon.